Endurance is not survival. Endurance is staying purposeful while everything around you demands collapse. Survival keeps the body alive. Endurance keeps the self intact. And Iqbal reminds us that true strength is not in holding on briefly, but in remaining aligned when the journey grows long. In Iqbal's framework, endurance is quiet strength, the long form of courage. It is the capacity to remain aligned, to remain purposeful, and to continue becoming, even when progress hides, and conditions offer no comfort. Endurance protects Khudi from fragmentation and despair, and transforms sustained struggle into lasting depth. Today we continue our 50-part journey through Asrar-e Khudi, Allama Iqbal's masterpiece on the formation of the self. This is episode 40. Together we explore endurance as the strength that matures identity, protects purpose, and carries the self through long seasons where transformation unfolds slowly but powerfully. Take a breath, settle your attention, and allow these reflections to sink in deeply. Endurance is not simply surviving. It is remaining purposeful while surviving. Survival keeps the body alive. Endurance keeps the self intact. The self learns that difficulty tests structure. Unstructured cells collapse. Structured cells deepen. The self understands that endurance is not stubbornness. Stubbornness resists change. Endurance adapts while continuing. The self realizes that endurance begins when ease ends. Ease requires no strength. Struggle reveals true capacity. The self sees that endurance is a kind of courage. A courage spread thin over long distances. Short bursts of bravery are easy. Sustained bravery builds character. The self learns that endurance is the art of holding direction. When progress is invisible, the visibility comforts. Endurance thrives without comfort. The self recognizes that endurance demands loyalty to purpose. Purpose forgotten ends effort. Purpose remembered pushes effort deeper. The self understands that endurance expands identity. What the self can survive becomes part of what it is. The self realizes that endurance requires a quiet heart. A noisy heart multiplies fear. A quiet heart absorbs tension. The self sees that endurance does not hurry. Hurry interrupts rhythm. Endurance aligns with it. The self learns that endurance is not about resisting pain. It is about integrating pain without surrendering meaning. The self recognizes that endurance transforms weakness. Weakness faced repeatedly reshapes into resilience. The self understands that endurance refines will. Will exercised becomes steady. Steadiness becomes authority. The self realizes that endurance protects the long-term vision from short-term emotion. Emotion changes quickly. Vision changes slowly. Endurance aligns both. The self sees that endurance reveals authenticity. Authentic selves continue. When applause ends, inauthentic selves collapse. Without validation, the self learns that endurance teaches timing. Not all obstacles should be attacked. Some must be outlasted. The self understands that endurance stabilizes hope. Hope without endurance collapses. Hope with endurance becomes certainty in motion. The self recognizes that endurance is the antidote to frustration. Frustration shortens perspective. Endurance widens it. The self realizes that endurance requires energy management. Not every battle deserves full force. Endurance prioritizes wisely. The self sees that endurance builds emotional maturity. Maturity replaces reaction with understanding. The self understands that endurance clarifies values. What the self is willing to endure reveals what it truly cares for. The self learns that endurance strengthens identity quietly. Quiet strength outlasts loud intention. The self realizes that endurance safeguards Khudi from collapse under pressure. Pressure reveals cracks. Endurance repairs them. The self sees that endurance is not heroic. It is steady, silent, persistent. The self understands endurance is the strength that does not announce itself. It simply continues. The self begins to understand that endurance is intelligence. Intelligence about limits. Intelligence about timing. Intelligence about energy. The self realizes that endurance does not demand constant strength. It demands steady strength. Strength held at a sustainable level over long periods of effort. The self learns that endurance requires pacing. Pacing prevents burnout. Pacing preserves commitment. Commitment stabilized creates transformation. The self sees that endurance is a negotiation between effort and recovery. Effort pushes forward. Recovery rebuilds capacity. Balance sustains becoming. The self understands that endurance must survive loneliness. Loneliness tests purpose. Purpose validated strengthens resolve. The self recognizes that endurance deepens creativity. Creativity emerges when the self stays. long enough in difficulty to see new possibilities. The self learns that endurance is not about resisting change. It is about enduring the discomfort that comes with change. The self realizes that endurance protects the self from the violence of despair. Despair arrives when effort feels irrelevant. Endurance reclaims relevance. The self sees that endurance is a form of discipline. Discipline strengthens identity. Identity strengthened stabilizes path. The self understands that endurance must be renewed. Renewal requires intention. Intention requires clarity. The self recognizes that endurance dissolves fear slowly. Fear tolerated loses power. Fear confronted repeatedly shrinks. The self learns that endurance expands capacity for suffering. Suffering understood becomes teacher. Suffering integrated becomes meaning. The self realizes that endurance is courage extended. Extended courage reshapes destiny. The self sees that endurance is a practice of remaining steady while feelings fluctuate. Feelings shift. Purpose remains. The self understands that endurance matures hope. Hope without endurance is fragile. Hope with endurance survives storms. The self recognizes that endurance builds inner authority. Inner authority stabilizes behavior. Stable behavior shapes future. The self learns that endurance teaches withdrawal wisely. Not every battle requires confrontation. Some require distance. Distance chosen is strength. The self realizes that endurance reshapes self-story. The self begins to say, I am the one who continues. Not, I am the one who collapses. The self sees that endurance reduces dependency on external encouragement. Encouragement fades. Endurance sustains. The self understands that endurance demands acceptance of slow progress. Slow does not mean ineffective. Slow means deep. The self recognizes that endurance prepares the self for responsibility. Responsibility grows only where endurance exists. The self learns that endurance restores order when chaos threatens direction. Order recovered preserves movement. The self realizes that endurance expands moral strength. Moral strength protects values. During difficulty, the self sees that endurance reduces emotional impulsiveness. Impulsiveness wastes energy. Endurance collects it. The self understands that endurance is proof of sincerity. Sincerity revealed through effort sustained over time. The self recognizes. Endurance is the self's agreement to keep becoming. Despite resistance, there comes a moment when the self understands that endurance is not punishment. It is preparation. Preparation for burdens the self is not yet strong enough to carry. The self realizes that endurance deepens character in ways comfort never can. Comfort preserves the present. Endurance prepares the future. The self understands that endurance transforms time from a threat into an ally. Time becomes the field where strength multiplies. The self sees that endurance clarifies loyalty. Loyalty to purpose. Loyalty to truth. Loyalty to becoming. What the self endures for reveals what it truly values. The self learns that endurance quiets panic. Panic demands escape. Endurance demands presence. Presence restores intelligence. The self recognizes that endurance purifies ambition. Ambition without endurance is fantasy. Ambition with endurance is destiny. The self understands that endurance strengthens faith. Faith untested remains fragile. Faith enduring trial becomes unshakable. The self realizes that endurance teaches balance. Balance between effort and acceptance. Between holding on and letting go. Between striving and trusting. The self sees that endurance protects meaning. Meaning born in difficulty becomes lasting meaning. The self learns that endurance gives depth to every achievement. Shallow victories fade. Endured victories echo. The self recognizes that endurance builds emotional gravity. Gravity anchors the self. When external conditions shift, the self understands that endurance is a dialogue between the self and reality. Reality resists. The self responds. Response defines maturity. The self realizes that endurance frees the self from the tyranny of immediacy. Immediacy forces reaction. Endurance enables intention. The self sees that endurance is a quiet declaration. I will not be shaped by difficulty. I will be shaped by my response to it. The self learns that endurance converts obstacles into pathways. Every barrier survived becomes a source of future strength. The self recognizes that endurance matures love. Love that endures transcends emotion and becomes devotion. The self understands that endurance must operate without applause. Applause is temporary. Endurance is permanent. The self realizes That endurance carries the self through the seasons when nothing makes sense. Understanding returns. After perseverance, the self sees. That endurance is a kind of dignity. Dignity expressed through refusal to collapse. And finally, the self understands. Endurance is not the self held together. It is the self held upright. Upright against fear. Upright against exhaustion. Upright against doubt. Through endurance, the self becomes unbreakable.